So the next subject we could talk about is out-of-home delivery, which seems very prevalent and interesting and metaphorically sexy at the moment. So what do you think the developments will be of smart locker networks across cities, suburbs, and transit hubs? What will be the developments and how will they look like? Do you want to go first, Gary?
Yeah, sure. So we're seeing a number of different things happening in different markets, and if you're talking about the UK specifically, then I think we've got the flight path for all of the carriers have been declared publicly now. So, Quadient will continue its rollout of its agnostic lockers. We've got we're heading towards 2,000 this year, 3,000 at minimum next year, and up to possibly 5,000 ultimately. And they are going to continue to be shared by Royal Mail, by Evri, and our other carrier partners. But at the same time, we're seeing the development of planned development of large networks by the big carriers. And so Amazon have already got a big network. InPost have got a strong presence as well. And now we're seeing Royal Mail and then Evri declaring they're going to do 20,000 and 10,000 respectively. So I think the main thing that will define the next 5 years will be the race for space. So it's where are the prime locations going to fall and who's going to get there and get the agreements to put them on the ground first. InPost have got a strong first mover advantage. They've been in the UK for a dozen years at least, and have got sort of 9,000 lockers, and you see them everywhere. And now everyone's playing a little bit of catch up. I think Quadient's strategy will remain the same of having lockers that are shared by multiple carriers. It means locations that would be potentially unattractive for a sole use locker remain attractive for a shared use locker. So I think their role will be definitely there long term. But you've got the two other big giants, if you like, Royal Mail and Evri, chasing down probably exactly the same people for exactly the same locations and exactly the same shops. So that's going to be an interesting next 2 or 3 years as they try to do that.
And Jamie, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, look, Gary's the expert on the at-home solutions, the lockers themselves. I think in terms of how they will be fulfilled, collected or delivered, I think will change, particularly in very high density areas, as we've discussed. I think and I saw this in Germany a month or so ago. Some of the areas are so restricted in terms of vehicle access, they have to basically take out bins, would be the best description of work, that are pre-sorted in the morning. They're taken out by vehicle, dropped in sort of micro fulfillment sites, sort of in zone, if you will, and then they're using cargo bikes and micro electric vehicles to come back to that place to replenish. I think that becomes much more prevalent. I think the frequency as well, it will be interesting. So how often, and I'm sure it's something that Gary and the team look at from a usage perspective. How frequently can these assets be? How many times can they be turned from a delivery and a collection point of view? Clearly, we talked about it earlier. There isn't a version of this where we just keep adding lockers, right? Every carrier in the world adding their own lockers and trying to scale that. I think the trick here is finding the right locations which are convenient for customers, and then finding efficient ways to be able to use those assets much more efficiently over time.
Thank you. And your thoughts on that, Rich?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's completely. You can see it yourself as a consumer. You only have to walk to any big supermarket and you can see there's limited space for these things. It makes complete sense to be, for one business to be serving multiple carriers. I think it'll be interesting from a tech perspective, what happens with the consumer journey at these locker and out-of-home delivery solutions. At the moment, it's pretty good in some cases already, right? Single QR code scan opens the locker and things like that. It still relies on an app. It still relies on a QR code. Will this become more deeply embedded with our personal technology that we have? There's things like biometric recognition of people and stuff like that might make the customer's experience even slicker than it is already. So, yeah, I think it feels like there's a lot of operational transformation to happen and unknowns at the moment. But I expect from a tech perspective, it's probably just going to be about a better user experience, actually, at the locker.
I think you're right, Rich. I mean, but the barcodes had its 50th anniversary a few years ago, so this is sort of 60-year-old technology, and it was a fop for how to represent information that a very simple reader can scan, and it stuck around much longer than most other bits of sort of kind of business technology. So it worked very efficiently. But there are other ways, as you say, to identify yourself, and I would like to see the consumer's dependence on having a QR code or a barcode diminish over time.
Good. And I'm going to ask the next question. I'll get you to answer it last, Gary. It makes sense to ask questions. So, will lockers be climate controlled, secure, and interoperable or parcel carrier agnostic between carriers as standard? What's your thoughts on that, Jamie? Jamie first.
Well, I think the interoperability or the sort of agnostic nature of lockers is already happening, right? So I think that's going to continue to happen. And if you think about it as a collective investment, there is value in an entire customer journey being owned by a single provider. So that I don't dismiss that for a second. But actually, if that locker network is spread more widely, to create more convenience for customers, would you actually drive usage overall, irrespective of which carrier that refers to? I think for me, I've heard it defined it's great with the slippers test. Would I be prepared to get off the sofa and walk 200 yards up the road in my slippers to post or collect something? Is often the point at which out of home switches into that's no longer convenient for me. So placement's going to be really important to drive adoption and usage. Frequency we've talked about. It would be a very specific use case, and maybe Rich and Gary can talk to this, where the investment for temperature controlled, etc., would pay off. That's a very niche use case. The vast majority of product that is moving in the UK particularly is ambient, and that does require temperature control. That's usually inside the container, so it's a polystyrene box with a chiller pack or whatever it might be that can usually live in our climate for a couple of days safely. So I wonder whether the investment to achieve that in a locker would outweigh the ability just to deal with that from a packaging perspective. Not sure the guys have a view, I'm sure.
Yeah, and your thoughts on that, Rich?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert at the kind of economics behind it, but logically, if you just kind of reverse time a little bit and look at temperature controlled logistics, it's a specific niche in logistics. It's not something that is generally served by the big final mile carriers. So I think Jamie's absolutely right. It doesn't, for me as a non-expert, Gary might correct me in a minute, but it doesn't feel like something that's going to be economic to invest in.
Okay. No, the environmental control business, you're absolutely right. The environmental cost of the amount of power required to keep the things cold all the time, on the occasion that there may or may not be something in there that with the right temperature, is just immense. And then what temperature do you choose? Is it 4 minus? Is it 4 degrees? Is it minus 18? Is it minus 27? So there's a whole world. We get inquiries for it. Lots and lots of organisations ask about it. Nobody ever buys it. So it sounds like a great idea, but the economics just never really seem to pay out. In terms of the interoperability, I think it's going to be essential. That obviously you would expect me to say that, but I think it is going to be essential, because it will either be by economic choice, where using a shared locker makes sense because there isn't the volume to have your own locker, or it's going to be pushed by legislation, where the organisation, the local government or council is only going to let you put one locker in a particular place, or they're going to free up space of their own for one organisation. Then everybody is going to have to play nicely and share.
Yeah, that would seem a lot, from an outside looking in, a logical answer that, hopefully market forces, but if not legislation, because there's no point competing in the same place. And also going on to the next question, will we see micro fulfillment centres and dark stores supporting last mile? One of the questions I've asked about is a thing called a community hub. And, if you go to a small village, could you have, a locker that becomes almost a micro hub for all deliveries, which could make things more efficient for everyone, to collect and deliver. So the question is, do you see micro fulfillment centres and dark stores supporting last mile? Maybe we'll ask yourself, Jamie, first.
Yeah, a micro sort of micro fulfillment centers probably will conjure a different picture in people's minds. Ultimately, if you think about the unit economics of last mile, there's a number of things that contribute. STEM being one of them, right? So the distance from the origin point to the first stop of that activity, and then the last stop back to its parent depot. So a bit the same in consumer fulfillment. Forward positioned inventory allows you to increase speed. Also, it allows you to increase the range of delivery method options you've got. You can move to cargo bikes and MEVs rather than larger vehicles, etc. And it improves the unit economics. So I would say absolutely yes. In certain areas, that will work particularly well in very, very high density areas. In terms of dark stores, I mean, there are a couple, probably Amazon's the greatest example of a retailer who actually does their own logistics. So there may well be scenarios where a bit like their sort of developments over the last number of years have been around speed. Yeah, so they will forward position inventory into city centres. That means you can get stuff in a couple of hours rather than next day or on a time definite basis next day. That'll be quite niche for those particular animals that do both fulfillment and their own logistics. I think as we came through and out of COVID, there was a bit of a fad, wasn't there, for sort of ultra fast delivery fulfillment. In the retail space, that seems to have diminished since then. I think people are more prepared to wait a little bit longer, or walk to Tesco's or Sainsbury's or whatever it might be. So maybe a wider question for the retail space, but certainly in the logistics space, I would see forward positioned micro fulfillment or micro logistics operations, a bit like in Germany, where you've got one opportunity in the morning to get work into a particular geography. And then at that point, you have to be using electrical vehicles or human-powered vehicles of some description. Yeah.
Okay. And your thoughts, Gary?
I think looking at this from a practical perspective, this is around waiting till you've got the network density to do this stuff. When we started off the UK network, I was having conversations with carriers, and they were saying, "Okay, how many lockers have you got? Where are they?" And the answer was none and nowhere. And then I was having conversations with potential host locations who could have a locker on site, and they were saying, "Oh, okay, great, yeah, we're interested. Who are your carriers? Who have you got?" And I would say, "Well, none and nobody." So it was a matter of getting the two horses racing at the same time, if you like. Now we have got a decent locker density. Organizations are coming to us with requirements that we can solve with a locker that we hadn't really considered before. And there's a very long list of all kinds of cool use cases that you can do once you've got your network up and running. So once you've got your sufficient density that these convenience objections have been overcome, there are lots of things that you can do. Interestingly, many of them are far more lucrative than parcels, because the unit economics have been driven down so hard, and all of the operators are looking for cost savings elsewhere. The amount of money available for our little time, we're not even the last mile, we're the last foot and a half. The little bit of money available for that is very, very small. Whereas some of these other potential use cases, the problem you're solving is much bigger. So therefore, they're potentially a lot more lucrative. So these are things that we are actively exploring, but you can't really do it until you've got thousands of lockers on the ground.
Yeah. Okay. No, I really appreciate that. And this one really could ask you first, Rich. Could voice activated or app-free lockers improve? I'll put accessibility, or the process or efficiency? Do you think that's realistic from an identification?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know about voice activation specifically, but I mean, we touched on it earlier. The ability to identify yourself by some other means than rifling through your email box to find a QR code that you received 2 days ago or whatever. That's got to be a way to make the consumer journey smoother. And everybody carries around phones. I mean, there's a debate around the future of that and what the next kind of consumer electronic revolution is. But for the time being, and certainly for the next 5 years, we're all going to be carrying these phones that have a whole multitude of different capabilities in terms of interfacing, whether it be like NFC or the whole biometric fingerprint stuff. So yeah, certainly, I don't know about voice activation specifically, but some other method than QR codes and barcodes has to be featuring pretty soon.
And would that be for Jamie and Gary? Whoever wants to go first. Would that? Do you think other options would be actually cheaper to service from your point of view, or does it almost not matter what the technology is?
It depends. We have to go back and retrofit whatever it is to thousands of lockers. Really, that's the critical part. So if so for example, I've been sort of championing NFC. Some sort of NFC reader. Lots of lockers have them. So that it can interact with your mobile phone. Maybe you send somebody a digital token. They put it in their wallet. As soon as you could become near the locker, it recognizes you're there. It says, "Welcome, Rich. We have a parcel for you. Look at door 7, pop." And you've done nothing other than walk up to the thing. So all of these things are possible, but they weren't possible when a lot of this technology was starting to be deployed. So it's the retrofit cost of going back and doing it all afresh is the challenge. If going forward, absolutely the machines of the future will be equipped to do all of this stuff.
And your thoughts on that, Jamie?
Yeah, I had very similar thoughts in my mind to Gary. It started with the question, which is what was the problem we're trying to solve here, right? It's about convenience in the general sense, and you can't really badge convenience. What one consumer considers convenient will be very different to another. But to Rich's point, do I want to be jumbling about trying to find was it a text, was it an email, was it a push notification? We know where the lockers are. Certainly, some of them don't move around, right? So as soon as somebody gets close to it and their phone acknowledges that they're there are things that we can do to just make that really, really slick, right? But I think, anything's possible, as Rich says, but realistically, what are we investing to try and solve here? Would we better put some of that cash towards, more lockers in more optimal locations that help more customers rather than, trying to take stones out of horses' hoofs, as my gran used to say.
Yeah. No, very much.
I've heard that before. It's a great expression.
The next one is the challenges and opportunities. So, what are the biggest risks or barriers to innovation in last mile logistics? And I'll probably maybe start off with you on that, Jamie.
Yeah, look, I think the biggest challenge often is we forget the number of people that are involved in this industry, right? We have more than 100,000 people who do a fantastic job for us every single day on the front line. And you've got to add to that all of the other carriers in the UK. There's probably the neck end of 1 million people that are involved in some way in last mile logistics in the UK. So innovation can often be confused with, we need you to work harder. I think we talked about it earlier, and I absolutely believe this is a good path forward for us all to follow, which is some of this job isn't attractive, loading and unloading trailers all day in 30-degree temperatures in the summer under fiberglass roofs is not a nice gig, right? 100+ stop multi-drop delivery drivers in high-density areas is a very stressful thing to try and do. So for me, I think it's about how do we try and make that easier for people? How do we help them do the things that humans do best, remove the repetitive risk and strain, and try and make them successful? I think the other obvious one is just about cost, right? To Gary's point about the lockers, and you could apply this in the other areas as well. Things are evolving so quickly. When do you make the decision to invest? Because in this day and age, in a very highly sort of technological world, things become obsolete quite quickly. So what am I investing in? What's its likely lifespan? I mean, good old-fashioned automation to move parcel down conveyors rather than people walking around with it is pretty tried and tested. But some of the more sophisticated tech stuff nowadays, I think, needs a bit more thinking about. And how will it bring value, right? You're taking long-term bets with big investments in technology and innovation. Are you sure that's going to stand the time of the changes in consumer behavior that we will see over the next 5 years? I think all three of us have talked about generational shift. Yeah. And it's going to happen, marketplace development, C2C type activity is a very, very different world to very big lorries full of parcels arriving in sort centres, direct from clients. So we've got to be able to live with that. So I would say cost, bringing our people with us when innovation is involved, because that's ultimately it's a threat to jobs in the industry to some extent when it's an automated process, and making sure that whatever we're investing in is a long-term bet that's going to play out in terms of improving customer experience would be my response. Yeah.
Thank you. And yourself, Gary?
I think it's very difficult to add to what Jamie just said, because obviously he's at the coalface of these big decisions. From our point of view, when we are talking to carriers and partner organisations, we're watching them struggling with trying to predict where the world's going to go in order to make a decision. So we've kind of put our bet on lockers being an important part of the future, and it's being borne out as a positive thing to have done. And we're dealing with lots of organisations are going through that change at very different points. If you look at the Nordics, they're way ahead of us, huge proportion of out of home, huge proportion going into lockers. Closer to home, we're kind of in the middle ground. You go to North America and it's nascent. There's very, very few deliveries into and out of lockers in Canada or the United States. So I think we're going to see a sort of evolution rather than a revolution in out of home delivery in the 5-year time horizon. But I think we'll be trying to keep up with other things. I think the transactional website as such will die within the next 5 to 10 years. The next generation don't shop like that. They watch a video on TikTok. They like the person's T-shirt. They click a button. The T-shirt arrives at their house. If they're in a hurry, the next day. If they're not in a hurry, 3 weeks later. And TikTok Shop has got 370 million parcels a year within 18 months of starting. It took ASOS 20 years to get to 90 million parcels. Now, that's a revolution. Now, ultimately, the output of that revolution is the same thing. A postman coming to your front door, smiling, giving you a parcel. So then, that where the rubber hits the road hasn't changed fundamentally, but the journey and the path to get there is utterly different and will be utterly different again in that timescale.
Well, that very nicely and interestingly fits nicely into the next question. So the question is to everyone, where do you see the most exciting investment or entrepreneurial opportunities in sort of the last mile over the next 5 years? So maybe how do you see it changing? Will it be things very different or quite similar? Maybe we'll ask you first, Rich, because obviously you probably
we've kind of covered we've covered quite heavily the opportunity from a kind of pure logistics, operational, delivery standpoint. I think there's a lot of investment opportunity upstream from that. Gary just touched on it, but the whole kind of user journey piece at the buying end of things, as opposed to receiving the delivery. It all kind of feeds in, right? All of these people buying through social platforms, people, there's talk about ChatGPT integrating with Shopify to change how people buy, things from Shopify vendors. All of that stuff is so cutting edge and at the moment that it's not really clear where that's going to go. But where there's change, there's usually opportunity. From my angle, I've always been at that kind of front end of it rather than actually, managing the guy at the doorstep. So I see quite a lot of potential opportunity to invest and grow by innovating at the point where the consumer buys the product as opposed to having it delivered.
Okay, and your thoughts, Jamie?
To be fair, I think Rich has covered it brilliantly. You would have to say there's probably not much margin in investing in the traditional bricks and mortar stuff. It's about investing in the tech that supports developing this network, I would say. Physical asset, all very interesting. You can yield from that. I would imagine low single digit numbers. The right bet in technology that takes off, to Gary's point, like some of the platforms have over the last sort of 3-4 years, is really where the entrepreneurs will be focusing their attention, I'm sure. Yeah.
It's actually quite hard to invest in final mile logistics in the UK, because if you look at who owns the significant players, Royal Mail is already traded as a PLC. Amazon is one of the 2 largest companies in the world. DPD is ultimately owned by the French government, etc. So when an organisation like Evri comes onto the market, it sells for £2.7 billion. So there is money around hunting for a way to try and find a way to invest in what is going to continue to be a boom and growth over the coming 5, 10, 20, and probably and beyond. But as soon as you get away from the kind of predictable investments like in an actual carrier, to Rich's point, then you are into the world of kind of speculative investment. When Metapack was sold to, which is now Octane, it was Stamps.com, now it's Octane. That's a relatively niche business that most people have never heard of. That helps retailers integrate into carriers and do carrier management and selection. $300 million was the purchase price for Metapack. So there's money around looking for a way to find its way into this market and invest. But I think there's a lot of speculation involved in, the best way to make a small fortune in this market is probably to start off with a large one.
That's a very, very profound statement. Investing, with hindsight can be good or bad. I totally agree with you. So, no, thank you for that, guys. And the next question we've got on the challenges and opportunities. How and will last mile delivery be integrated into supply chains and logistics networks more holistically? Because there's almost, it appears like, an order goes through a 3PL, then it's given to a carrier or a mail network, and then it's delivered. Do you think that end-to-end process could be slicker, easier, or will it always be the same? Maybe we'll ask you first on that side, Gary.
I don't really have a strong view on this because this isn't my sphere of expertise. I think you might see some end-to-end consolidation of some of the technology. You saw Doddle get soaked up by Blue Yonder, which are big into WMS and so on. You might see some of these what are already fairly large tech players in the logistics and fulfillment industry start to consolidate themselves. But at the moment, apart from sort of SAP and Oracle and so on, there's still you're dependent on quite siloed bits of technology to move products and orders from one place to another. The organisation that clearly has done this already is Amazon. So they almost from cutting the trees down to make the paper box through to delivery on the doorstep, they own everything, but they are the exception rather than the rule. So unless you see another contender taking that path, I'm not sure we'll see massive change.
Okay, and your thoughts on that, Jamie?
Yeah, so Amazon are absolutely the example, right? They are arguably the only people that truly optimize a supply chain all the way through from inventory placement to delivery with the consumer. And I don't think there's many people placed to be able to do that have got the kind of scale and technical capability that Amazon have. Whilst they're a retailer, they're also a very, very capable technology organization as well that can, that can give most the run for their money, I would say. To be honest, I think there's always in-source, outsource, fulfillment capability. There's always those decisions. Do we build it or buy it type decisions. Few have got the scale. I think to be able to consider their own last mile networks or to consumer networks, you may see some diversification from some of the carriers into storage and fulfillment as opposed to the other way around. But I don't think it will be in large scale, right? I think I think when you look at what the proposition is for most of the big players out there, it's pretty clear what they do. They'll offer a range of services from, kind of same day movements all the way through to kind of deferred, slower moving traffic, so that consumers can choose what works for them. They're increasing the range of delivery options, whether that's to home, out of home, etc., etc. I don't see a major movement into kind of upstream supply chain integrations. I don't think it would necessarily help move those carriers forward at this moment in time.
Okay, and Rich, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the one thing, if you kind of zoom out a little bit and look at how the world looked 10 years ago to how it does today, everything was a lot less connected, right? So if you're a retailer and you sell, I don't know, mugs, you go and deal usually with one carrier, perhaps for your UK distribution. You perhaps have to do some kind of complex integration either yourself, to Gary's point, people like Metapack made that easier. and not much spoke to one another. You know, you get even down to kind of receiving your bill. You got like a big lump of paper through the post every week, as opposed to any kind of like electronic output. I think nowadays there's a lot more interactive, you know, data interaction between systems, and that kind of ripples up through the supply chain. There's still quite a lot of areas where there is kind of very little visibility, things like sea freight and stuff like that, where, you know, to Gary's point, maybe there will be a scenario where you can have it for a fraction of the price, but it's going to take 2 weeks and it's coming from China. Well, I think consumers are still going to want to have a pretty accurate idea of when that's going to land, even if it is in a couple of weeks' time. So, you know, I think I can envisage better flow of data up the supply chain back to the manufacturer. And I think the other point to this is around that consumer buying journey again. So again, 10 years ago, maybe you had one supplier, you get a rate card, the customer goes on the website and chooses, you know, standard delivery. People want options now, and carriers are making it easier to do that. So, you know, you can dynamically pull a rate from a carrier based on the consumer's basket and present them different options at checkout, stuff like that. All that's assuming that the kind of e-commerce website persists. But yeah, I think largely, if you know, in answer to the question, how will they be more deeply integrated? I think we'll just get better visibility and a better flow of data between each step in the supply chain.